Good morning, fellow humanists. My name is Todd Kimball. I'm your MC today, and it is a reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice.
The reading this morning is about emergence, and here goes. What is it like to be an electron? There is nothing that it is like to be an electron, but there is much that we know about electrons. One thing that we know is that they cannot possibly be purple. Consider the idea of emergence. Think of the colors that you experience. They are emergent. They emerge from electromagnetic waves. Think about water. We experience water as wet, but we know that water is made up of molecules, and no single H2O molecule can possibly be wet. Wetness and moisture emerge from molecules. Think about warmth. Warmth is like moisture. Some of our experiences are both warm and moist. Warmth and moisture are subjective. There are two different kinds of reality, subjective and objective. Objective reality is mindless. Some people think that mind permeates all of reality. Other people say that mind exists only subjectively in the brains of humans. How do we know that the universe is mindless? Do we need to assume a mindless universe in thinking about a reality that we never made? After all, we do need some kind of starting point. Materialism is the starting point for science, and science uses mathematics. For that matter, mathematics itself has a starting point. Geometry, for example, begins with axioms. Arithmetic begins with numbers, and these numbers have interesting properties. Here's one. I'll bet everybody knows this. Every number is either a prime number or can be represented as a product of prime numbers. The Bible is the starting point for Christianity. In the beginning, an all-powerful, mindful God. It's a story. Science has a different story. In the beginning, the Big Bang. Nothing mindful at all in the Big Bang, just matter, energy, fields, radiation, and stuff like that. It took a long time for mind to emerge from stuff like that. And here we are, going about our business, fully able to think about stuff like this.
At a time when women's rights are under attack from our national leadership, it is helpful to get a historical perspective on women's fights for autonomy and opportunity. Lydia Reeder discusses the 19th century origin of a pseudoscience that claimed to connect all of women's ills to her uterus. She discusses the women's doctors and suffragists who fought back against this attempt. But Lydia is an acclaimed author and has had rave reviews for her book, The Cure for Women. But please, let's have a warm welcome from our friendly house audience and a warm but muted welcome from our Zoom audience for Lydia Reeder.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak this morning. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to hear what you think about the courageous life of Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby and her battle for the advancement of women in medicine. Her achievements in women's healthcare are completely relevant to the issues we're facing today. For example, just the other day, a friend of mine ended up in the emergency room because of a blinding migraine headache. She's had chronic migraines since giving birth to her daughter several years ago and happened to ask the ER doctor if he thought the headaches were caused by hormone changes after her child was born. The doctor kind of laughed and told her that all women's diseases were caused by their reproductive systems. My friend was really shocked by his answer. She couldn't believe he had said something that could have been said by a physician to a female patient 200 years ago. My book, The Cure for Women, reveals the 19th century origin of the pseudoscience that allegedly connects all of women's ills to her uterus. It tells the story of the women doctors and suffragists led by Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, who fought back against this attempt to control women's bodies and lives. It brings to life the daring life of the brilliant Dr. Jacoby, and let me be clear, I'm in awe of her achievements during a time when women had few options outside of marriage. For hundreds of years, until the 19th century, midwives cared for pregnant women and their families in Europe and America. All births occurred at home and were overseen by the midwife and her network of attendants, who provided comfort, nourishment, and nurturing while patiently waiting for the entirely natural process of labor and birth. Together, women endured the pain and the dangers, looked to one another for support, and shared the happiness of successful deliveries and the devastation when a child or mother was lost. The midwife's special skill complemented women's duties at home, which strengthened the midwife's position as a legitimate, socially acceptable professional woman. For generations, midwives had successfully bridged the gap between public domestic life for women. But around the turn of the 19th century, male physicians discovered that attending to women's pregnancies was very profitable. It was a way for them to connect with families and build their practices. They began to institutionalize the practice of medicine by establishing the new specialization of obstetrics and gynecology, and also requiring appropriate formal education and licensing. The male doctors promised patients that the use of new technologies like forceps, therapeutic drugs like opium, and especially ether and chloroform would protect against the overwhelming pain and terrors of birth. The only hope for the continued existence of women as midwives, especially in cities, was for these women to gain access to the mechanical instruments, the scientific knowledge, and the proper licensing necessary to advance their skills. But in 1820, an esteemed doctor from Harvard wrote an essay so controversial that he decided to publish it anonymously. He titled his work "Remarks on the Employment of Females as Practitioners in Midwifery," and he wrote, "The question is, can the practice of midwifery be carried on with equal safety by female as by male practitioners?" The simple construction of his sentences hid the fact that his proposals were meant to destroy centuries of tradition and terminate the practice of midwifery. That's why, when the anonymous Harvard physician set out to discredit women as midwives in his essay, he focused not only on their lack of medical education, but also on why they should not be educated at all. "It is obvious that we cannot instruct women as we do men in the science of medicine," he wrote. "Females should never be allowed to enter the dissecting room or the hospital except as patients, because their refined sensibility and delicate bearing would be completely destroyed." During this time, the lives of middle and upper class 19th century women were deeply shaped by what was called the cult of true womanhood, which was set firmly in the private sphere of the home and the family. In a rapidly changing world of the Industrial Revolution, where men were charged with forming an industrialized civilization from the vast wilderness, The true woman, the angel of the home, embraced her natural tendencies toward piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, and exerted a serenely moral influence over her husband. She and her children were considered the bright inner sanctum against the corrupt outer world. Confined to the private domain of home and family, where the husbands ruled the household, women had no legal rights as an individual and very little say in their own medical care. In fact, they often feared the doctor's arrival. Because of this fear, medical schools taught their all-male students how to verbally coerce a reluctant woman to submit to an examination. In order to preserve female modesty and also reassure husbands, the male obstetricians examine patients fully clothed in the dark and by touch. The whole process was less like the practice of medicine and more like spelunking. Charles Meigs, the professor of obstetrics and diseases of women at Jefferson Medical College, was considered to be America's expert on women's health. In his best-selling book, Females and Their Diseases, published in 1848, he wrote that woman has a head almost too small for intellect, but just big enough for love. She was queen of the loves. He informed his students that by studying female sex organs, they would have expertise over a woman's whole being. As a result, many women refused to be examined even though they were quite ill. Elizabeth Blackwell, who became the first woman in America to graduate from medical school in 1849, Blackwell wanted to provide sick women the option of seeing a woman doctor. Ultimately, after she graduated, she was rejected by every hospital and clinic in New York City and had to open her own infirmary. In the beginning, she felt extremely lonely in her fight to be a doctor. Then she met Anne Preston, a recent graduate from the newly opened Female Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. The college was founded in 1850 by a group of powerful Quaker doctors, all wealthy abolitionists and philanthropists, who felt that it was a moral imperative for women to be educated as medical doctors. According to one founder, he proclaimed many sensitive women were seen suffering and dying rather than shock what they felt to be the sacredness of their womanhood and be examined by a man. Even worse, doctors heard that some husbands were refusing to permit the indecency of male doctors bringing their children into the world. The proper education of more women doctors would alleviate this tragedy and save the lives of countless loving mothers. These Quaker men had applied for and received a charter from the Pennsylvania State Legislature in May 1850 for the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, making it one of the first institutions in the world to grant women legitimate regular medical degrees. A member of the first graduating class, Anne Preston received her degree in December 1851. Apparently, women becoming medical doctors seemed deeply subversive to some in the Philadelphia community. The mayor of Philadelphia had to send 50 policemen to Preston's commencement to ward off threatened disruptions. This meeting between Elizabeth Blackwell and Anne Preston changed everything. Preston told Blackwell that women physicians would not suffer the same fate as midwives. It was women's destiny to become doctors. Preston told Blackwell that if any women were supposed to remain in their own separate feminine world, why should men be allowed to treat them at all? In fact, women doctors, like good mothers, should take care of the health of other women and their children. This was a powerful argument, and it worked. Beginning in 1857, with Blackwell's opening of her New York Infirmary for Women and Children, women doctors built their own first-rate healthcare institutions in New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. In addition, they formed their own medical associations. These hospitals, medical schools, and professional organizations were among the first women-owned institutions in America. Unlike most regular medical schools that accepted only white men, these women-owned institutions practiced diversity. By 1900, the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania had graduated approximately a dozen Black women doctors, the first woman doctor from India, the first Native American woman doctor, and other women MDs originally from China, Syria, and South America. During this time, the most popular women's magazine in the country wrote editorials that said that women were, and I quote, by nature better qualified than men to take charge of the sick and suffering. More women began to ask for women doctors. In 1859, 17-year-old Mary Putnam gained clinical experience by working for Elizabeth Blackwell at her clinic. The eldest of 11 children, Mary was the daughter of the publishing entrepreneur George Palmer Putnam and his wife, Victorine. At age 9, she discovered a recently deceased rat in the family barn and asked her mother if she could slice open its abdomen to observe its heart, lungs, and stomach contents. Disgusted, her mother forbade her to touch the disease-carrying animal, but Mary, who also showed a talent for literature, writing, and teaching, for her whole life she remained fascinated with animal dissection. Growing up, Mary was always the cleverest person in the room. Although she was nicknamed Minnie by her size, her view of the world was as tall, wide, and clear as if she were gazing from a mountaintop. Her parents encouraged Mary's vivid imagination. Evenings at the Putnam house were spent entertaining professors, ministers, scientists, and authors, including Edgar Allan Poe, Washington Irving, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Mary, aged 10 at the time, would put a sign on the front door just before the first arrivals that read, "Nobody admitted who cannot talk." In 1854, when Mary was 12 years old, her father published Elizabeth Blackwell's first book, The Laws of Life, because he liked her ideas about hygiene and public health. Its success allowed Blackwell to build her practice and got her invited to the Putnam family gatherings. Like most Victorian men, George Putnam considered the practice of medicine to be an improper profession for ladies. He directed Mary toward the proper feminine professions like teaching and writing. Unlike the so-called spinster Blackwell sisters, many women who were teachers and writers also attracted husbands and raised children. Putnam feared that if Mary became a doctor, considered to be a highly masculine profession, her soft femininity would harden, her ability to have children would diminish, and he would lose his wonderful daughter. Even so, because he admired and loved his gifted daughter more than he approved of women doctors, he let 17-year-old Mary gain medical experience by working at Elizabeth Blackwell's New York infirmary. Mentored by Elizabeth and her sister, Emily Blackwell, at the time Mary fell in love with science. The whole world opened up to her after she viewed human cells through a microscope. At age 21, she became the first woman in America to earn a degree in pharmacy when she graduated from the New York College of Pharmacy. In 1864, she earned her Doctor of Medicine from the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, which was later renamed the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. But she still wasn't satisfied with the extent of her knowledge. Mary wanted to be the best. So she set her sights on the finest medical school in the world at the Sorbonne in Paris. Despite the fact that the Sorbonne had never accepted women in the 600 years it had existed. She worked as a teacher until she had saved enough money to travel to Paris. After she arrived, Elizabeth Blackwell helped her find work in several hospital clinics. Eager to secure funds for her continuing education, Mary Putnam used her growing access to these clinics and hospitals in Paris to become the Paris correspondent for the Medical Record, a highly respected American journal. Speaking to the American Men of Medicine in a column titled Medical Matters in Paris, she described her observations of working on clinical rounds with her famous instructors. She wrote about Bright's disease, tracheotomies, or ovarian versus renal cysts, cholera, thyroid function, and lithotomies. Disguising her gender, she signed her articles PCM, a reversal of her actual initials. Later, she would secure correspondence positions with the New York Evening Post and her father's own Putnam's Monthly. In addition, she worked in the laboratories of some of the greatest research scientists in the world. She was so intelligent and yet so unobtrusively feminine, instructors began competing to see who could obtain connections for Putnam that would gain her admittance. She made them want to teach her. It was an unequaled achievement. It took 2 years of brilliant clinical work and clever networking, but Mary Putnam became the first woman accepted into the Paris Medical School in 1868. She even endured the 1870 siege of Paris by the Prussians in their war with France in order to continue her studies and graduate. After she graduated, Mary was one of the best educated physicians in the world. When she returned to America, she would bring science to medicine in the form of evidence-based practice. In fact, an article in the Lancet Medical Journal in 2021 credited Mary Putnam Jacobi as one of the most remarkable minds of the 19th century medicine for bringing laboratory science and evidence-based practices that she learned in the Parisian clinics to American medicine. As one of her male physician friends later wrote, her knowledge of science was so wide and her criticism so keen, fearless, and just that in our discussions we felt it prudent to shun the field of speculation and to walk strictly in the path of demonstrated facts. After she returned from Paris, she became the professor of materia medica at Elizabeth Blackwell's Medical School for Women in New York City. She organized the Association for the Advancement of the Medical Education of Women and tirelessly advocated for women's acceptance into the regular medical schools like Harvard. In 1873, she married Abraham Jacobi, a highly respected children's physician who would later be known as the father of pediatric medicine. By this time, there were almost 2,500 women practicing medicine in America. The success of Elizabeth Blackwell, Mary Putnam Jacobi, and the women-run medical institutions inspired a furious backlash from the many elite male physicians in America. I want to emphasize that not all prominent physicians were against women doctors. Elizabeth Blackwell and the other women who built women's hospitals and medical schools depended on the backing of highly respected physicians to sit on their board of directors or even participate in the final examinations of students in order to reassure competency and to give them respectability. Dr. Henry Bowditch, professor of clinical medicine at Harvard and founder of the Massachusetts State Board of Health, was singularly responsible for women finally being accepted into the Massachusetts Medical Society in 1884. But those physicians who rejected women doctors were extremely powerful people. They not only believed that women were unfit for the job, but they also felt that including women actually debased or diminished the profession itself. These physicians included Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., Dean of Harvard Medical School, Horatio Storer, the AMA Vice President and leader of the Physicians' Crusade Against Abortion, and S. Ware Mitchell, the famous Philadelphia neurologist and inventor of the rest cure. Treating women patients had made these men extremely wealthy. They claimed that the advancement of women into any profession besides teaching or nursing was a danger to the very existence of American life. These so-called experts staged a very public and intense campaign against women going to college. These men, considered the experts of their day, published the so-called scientific papers claiming without any data that women were biologically incapable of performing any profession because their menstrual cycles made them perpetually sick and emotionally unbalanced. As S. Ware Mitchell wrote, I said I did not believe it was best either for the sick or for society for women doctors that personally women lose something of the natural charm of their sex in giving themselves either to this or to the other avocations until now in sole possession of man. But the most popular attack against the higher education of women was an essay titled Sex in Education or A Fair Chance for the Girls, published in 1873 by Dr. Edward H. Clark, a Harvard professor and doctor of otology who was a protege of Oliver Wendell Holmes. Drawing from the works of Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, and S. Ware Mitchell, Clark declared that scientific evidence proved that the health of females today was disastrous, a national tragedy. American girls were experiencing a frightful deterioration based solely upon personal interactions with patients and not data. Clark renounced co-education in elementary and secondary schools and endorsed school education segregated by the sexes. As he wrote, a bath was a necessary and purifying process for all, but it is not wise for the two sexes to bathe at the same time and in the same tub. He recommended that girls should study less than 4 hours per day and rest every fourth week to accommodate their menstrual cycles. All of this would be overseen, of course, by their physicians. Clark cautioned that if females performed too much brain work, they would devolve into a third gender called a gene, similar to the sexless class of termites. For evidence, Clark told personal stories that linked a woman's illness to her academic or professional accomplishments, sometimes with deadly results. Finally, by relating it all to a warped vision of evolutionary progress, Clark would influence the debate about the science of sex differences for years to come. Clark's book was an international bestseller. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in an essay published in the Atlantic magazine that in this fight to pacify the females so that they would calmly and happily get married and reproduce, Clark was akin to Abraham Lincoln, leading the learned white men into a battle that they must win. As a result, Clark's dire predictions about the frailty of women's health were amplified by newspaper articles across the country. One journalist wrote that he hoped the new science ended women's suffrage for good. But not all academics were happy with Clark's essay and its lack of scientific research. Each year, a prestigious committee in the Harvard Boylston Medical Society devised special essay topics for the annual Boylston Medical Prize. The competition was meant to encourage research into little-known areas of medicine. All essays were submitted and judged anonymously. At the close of 1874, the committee, whose members included Boston's most important medical men, decided to add fuel to the fire raging over women's health and higher education. They proposed the following question for 1876, which was 2 years in advance to allow enough time for research. Do women require mental and bodily rest during menstruation, and to what extent? The Boylston Committee's topic shocked and excited the leading women's rights activists, including abolitionist Julia Ward Howe, Lucy Stone, and C. Alice Baker. The committee understood that if science proved that women were biologically incapable of complex thinking, their pursuit of the vote for women would be impossible. Women needed their own elite medical scientist to win the Boylston Prize and prove Clark wrong, but at the time, only one such person existed, Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi. Even though no woman had ever been allowed to participate in the competition, they were hopeful. Their champion had proven herself to be smarter than most men. She could win. But Jacobi was pregnant with her first child at the time and hesitated at first. As a result, she began her research for the essay nearly a year after the Boylston Committee's announcement about the menstruation topic. So she decided to join forces with the vast network of the women's rights movement and devised an innovative technique for gathering information that had never been used in scientific research, but would allow women to speak for themselves. She sent out a questionnaire. Women's rights volunteers helped copy and distribute the survey and then gather their responses. In addition, Jacobi formulated a series of experiments that she carried out with the help of her colleagues at the New York Infirmary for Women and Children. Jacobi set out to do something unheard of in medical research. For the very first time in medical science, using the most current experimental technologies, she mapped the physiological and chemical signs of menstruation related to the actual physical changes in women's bodies. She even noted how body temperatures changed throughout their cycles. Her breakthrough led to the discovery that these temperature changes indicated ovulation and eventually led to a form of natural family planning and birth control known as the rhythm method. In her groundbreaking essay about her research called The Question of Rest During Menstruation, Jacoby summarized her findings and made recommendations using the precise and formidable language of science. The essay did win her the Boylston Medical Prize in 1876, making her the first woman to win that award. It was a landmark moment for women in medicine, challenging the flawed yet widely held beliefs about women's bodies. By the mid-19th century, physicians and scientists still had no concrete notion of how women's reproductive systems actually worked, even though no other mammal menstruated monthly, and scientists had never seen a human egg outside of the uterus. It was so-called common knowledge that menstruation was similar to the monthly heat in female dogs, pigs, cats, horses, and so on. They believed that women also went into heat every month when they ovulated and were the most fertile during their periods. In her essay, Jacoby dismissively referred to it as the rutting theory. As she wrote, the theory began with a time bomb of sexuality called the rut and ended with a violently ruptured ovary that forcefully expelled eggs, wounded the uterus, and caused a monthly outpouring of blood and gore. A woman's entire body was supposed to suffer in sympathy with her reproductive organs. That's why, she stated, the menstrual process has come to be considered as a mark of constantly recurring debility, a means of constantly recurring exhaustion, demanding rest as decidedly as a fracture or a paralysis. Not to mention monthly hysteria. Jacoby fiercely opposed the rutting theory because she said it isolated menstruation from all other physiological processes in women and turned a natural bodily function into a debilitating pathology. Even worse, she wrote, women had absorbed the widespread cultural view that their bodies were weak and sick. She said that her research would replace this cult of weakness with her theory of strength. Jacoby proposed a modern interpretation of women's reproductive physiology based on the theory that menstruation was simply the body's evacuation of a nutritional surplus. In this case, nutrition meant the continuous regeneration of cells and tissues to preserve life. Like waves in the ocean, women experienced the rising levels of nutrition or vital force throughout each monthly cycle. Jacoby guided the study of women's health away from ovarian and uterine diseases and their connection to mental illness, and toward the simple process of cellular nutrition. In this framework, the menstruating woman was not undergoing a violent congestion and hemorrhage of the uterus, as suggested in the rutting theory. She was experiencing a normal event in the growth and death of tissues. Using the evidence provided in her surveys and experiments, Jacoby demonstrated how the wave of vitality and nutrition increased in her subjects before and during menstruation. She called it the menstrual wave. Jacoby concluded that women were likely most fertile up to 2 weeks after menstruation, not during their periods. She wrote that menstruation was like any other bodily function. She stated that reproduction in the human female is not intermittent, but incessant, not periodical, but rhythmic, not dependent on the volitions of animal life, but is involuntary and inevitable as are all the phenomena of nutritive life. Any pain or disability related to menstruation was relieved not by rest, but by action. Practically, Jacobi explained, we find that the habit of disordered and painful menstruation is more frequently associated with habits of feeble muscular exercise than with any other one circumstance. As a result, Jacobi advised more physical activity, calisthenics, sports, and even exercise machines to build women's health. In her essay, she summarized with mocking humor, the menstrual flow is the least important part of the menstrual process. And if Clark's arguments for rest were to be enforced among young women, he should consign them to the inactivity of a Turkish harem, where indeed anemia, if not dysmenorrhea, is said to be extremely frequent. Lastly, she wrote that her findings do not in the least show that menstruation, per se, constitutes any temporary predisposition to either hysteria or insanity. Just as food digested, hair grew longer, and hearts beat rhythmically, women menstruated. Jacobi's research in women's health compelled other women to follow in her footsteps and continue her efforts to depathologize menstruation, providing empirical data that proved women's intellectual capacity. Jacobi's study of menstruation led to the beginning of a paradigm change for women's lives, that women were individuals who have a right to be educated and the freedom to choose their own happiness. Mary Putnam Jacobi saw a future for women that has come to fruition today, but once again, women are fighting to preserve that freedom. As Mary Putnam Jacobi often advised, risk everything, work hard, and reach for the stars, but most of all, organize. Thank you.
What a beautiful presentation. It was both uplifting and scary at the same time. I really appreciated it, and your slides were amazing.
About, all the myths that were about menstruation affecting women's health and, the hemorrhaging are, they're, the Abrahamic religions based a lot of their taboos about touching menstruating women. They're unpure, isolate them as much as you can. I can imagine there was a lot of pushback, not just from the medical male tradition, but also by the clergy of that time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wish I could have written about that too. I read some about it, but they were equally perturbed, especially because there were the first women clergy back then too. Women seemed to be invading all of their typically male territories, and it was a shock to say the least.
Lydia, I'll ask a question as we wait for other questions from the Friendly House and from the chat. You are so well versed in this topic and clearly so passionate about it. I was wondering, as you did your research and as this has been a long-time passion of yours, what was the biggest surprise in writing the book or preparing for talks like this?
Oh, gosh. Well, it was very interesting to me because I started out reading biographies of the first women doctors like Harriet Hunt and Elizabeth Blackwell and Marie Zashevska, all of them amazing women. And then I started putting it all together, and I realized, my first book was about one of the earliest women's basketball teams. Well, I realized that these women in their own way, even though they had personalities, they were all strong personalities and they really clashed over things. They worked as a team, and their goal was to get other women educated as doctors. They wanted to help women. They worked with feminists and suffragists, and it was like I began to see the overall picture, and it was just amazing to me. I was in awe of what they did, really, really and truly.
Let's stay in the Zoom audience and go to Jules. I know Jules has a great question today. He's got a lifetime of history in the medical profession and a long time on the East Coast as well. So, Jules, I'm sure you have a great question this morning.
So the comment was made, I think, by Todd and somebody else, that the formal religions did not encourage womanhood in the sense that we now know is appropriate. And to add to that story, my mother had me and my two older brothers, late 1920s and 1930s, at home, delivered by a general practitioner. My grandmother was the midwife. She wouldn't go near a hospital. I never saw my mother in a slip. They were so curtailed. Now, the horror of this Orthodox Jewish upbringing was that when my father died and married for more than 50 years, she was not allowed to go to the burial because she may be having her menses. The idea that a woman is unclean was so pervasive in the mindset of males. Do you think we are at a point now where men using different language are any different? I don't think they are.
I think perhaps intellectually they know better, but subconsciously the myth prevails that, women are icky, they have cooties, things like that, for one reason or another. Perhaps we're seeing what we're seeing today in politics because that way of viewing women was slipping away, kind of going away, and more women were becoming professional. Women doctors were making up more than half the profession. So it's very interesting to contemplate. And believe me, while writing this book, I kept wondering. I even looked up, when I was a kid, they were talking about how women drivers were naturally terrible drivers. And I was one of the best drivers in my driver's ed class. And so I decided, I looked up, why did they think that? Well, it was because they didn't want women being able to adventure far away from home easily. So they spread the rumor that women were terrible drivers and that they would crash and burn and die. But women, of course, proved that not to be true. And the people in the auto industry said, let women drive because they'd make more money. And so it all came to fruition to the way it is today. But it's interesting how these rumors turn into facts.
Yeah.
Let's go to our live audience at the Friendly House for question number 1.
That would be me. And thank you, Lydia, for the very good presentation. I really appreciated it. And also my question is the male population, Dr. World, interpreted women's problems coming from their uterus quite a bit, I think. I think that's implied, that it all had to do with that feminine part. And so are there some other examples? I mean, we're bringing up our own, that we have experienced, but also were there other examples of how they were completely misguided in their diagnoses because of where they were going with that?
Oh, absolutely. In one instance, I don't know if there was puerperal fever or childbed fever back then, especially in the hospitals, killed both the woman and the child. It was right after childbirth. The doctor would attend, and then suddenly she would fill with all this white fluid and she would die, and the baby would die. And they came to realize, but they didn't believe it and they thought that what was happening was that somehow her milk production had overflowed and drowned them both. But what it turned out, of course, that these doctors who often would go from the morgue, dissecting bodies in the morgue, to help delivering a baby, didn't wash their hands and didn't clean up. In fact, wearing the gore around often made them feel more manly. And so they would go and deliver babies and pass on any infections that the dead body might have into the woman. And this reached a height in Boston, I read, at they called it the Lying In Hospital there. And this was in the mid 19th century, 1850 to 1860. And they had to close the hospital down because so many women and their babies were dying. And finally, they discovered bacteria and realized that the physician was transferring the deadly bacteria and causing the infection themselves. And in the beginning, somebody like Charles Meigs, who was the premier women's doctor of the time, said, "Oh my gosh, doctors are gentlemen, and a gentleman's hands are always clean." And he brushed it off and didn't believe it. But actually, it was introduced by Oliver Wendell Holmes after he saw it proved in England, when he heard Dr. Lister speak. But eventually here it became common for them to use sterile technique and to be sterilized before they deliver babies. But at the women's hospitals, they kind of adapted the midwives' technique of always washing their hands and providing clean bed sheets all the time. Everything was clean. Marie Zashevska at her hospital in Boston even had them wash up with, I think, a form of Clorox back then between patients. And she had learned that when she became a midwife in Germany. And there were much fewer deaths of women and babies at their hospitals than at their regular lying-in hospitals. So yes, there are many instances of that.
Let's go back to our Zoom audience for a question from Anand. Anand.
Thank you, Lydia, for your incredible presentation. Considering the resistance Dr. Jacoby faced from a male-dominated medical community, what lessons do you think are most significant regarding A, understanding the human condition, and B, overcoming status quo bias? Thank you.
Persistence and confidence and a network of support. She learned that she believed that the rise in science would lead to the rise of women's rights. And in the end, she was proved correct, because when you get down to the cellular level, everybody's the same. And that's kind of what she saw. I'm sorry, repeat the last part of your question.
No, I mean, it's similar. It's just about overcoming status quo bias, because to your point, at a molecular level and a material level, we're all the same. And yet at the same time, from a cognitive position, we all have status quo bias. There's a reluctance to change, particularly for people within a power paradigm. People who are in positions of power are more reluctant to change. So I'm just curious. Yeah.
Well, she liked to reassure the doctors, especially in Paris, that she would not attract them with her feminine wiles. She always wore black wherever she went. She was entirely conscious of how she affected the men in the room. And yet she believed she didn't hesitate to outshine them academically. And she just had a way of understanding that sort of dilemma that she was in, but also, as somebody said, women and those people who are barred from certain places in life always have to work harder, study harder, and gain more expertise. And that's exactly what she did. But she was constantly aware of that bias.
I'll read a short question from Hank Robb. He writes, the depth of belief in the theory in the Victorian households was the practice of giving all female servants a paid week off to rest every month to ensure their health, right?
No, that's what one of the women, they, to answer Edward Clark, they published several books, the feminists and Julia Ward Howe and all these women put together. Mary Putnam Jacobi was one, but one woman wrote that. She said, okay, what about the teacher who's also a woman? Are we going to give her a week off too? I mean, where does this stop? No, it was completely silly. It was a completely silly argument, but that didn't matter.
I'm constantly aware of how badly our sense of history is. We are always surprised when things happen earlier than we realized. And so when you put the slide up there of all the interaction with Native, Black, Oriental, Mid-Eastern women, how did that come about? And I know that a lot of the men at the time were influenced by Eastern thought, transcendentalism and that sort of thing. But how did the interaction and the communication with women from those atmospheres, how did that get started?
You know, that's an area that I didn't read a lot into, but Anne Preston, which I talked about earlier in the slides, eventually became the dean of the Women's Medical School of Pennsylvania. And she was a Quaker herself, and welcomed all races, the women who wanted and could do the work and graduate. It's very interesting if you remember, oh gosh, what was that show back in the 90s? Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman? Somebody told me that it starred Jane Seymour. I remember it vaguely. But anyway, the Women's Medical School of Pennsylvania, that's where she graduated from in the TV show. So it's very interesting whether they had interpreters or how they went about doing that, but it must have been exactly that way. It's an interesting subject I'd like to look more into.
Yeah, thank you so much I love this presentation. It was really well done. I wanted to go back to when Dr. Jacobi is going to the Sorbonne, is trying to get into the Sorbonne. And at that point, I believe she had a degree in pharmacology, but yet I think I heard you say she became a teacher to save up enough money to go to France. Why did she choose teaching rather than working as a pharmacist?
Well, because there's a whole story that I left out about her and the Civil War. After she graduated from pharmacy school, it turned out that her younger brother was fighting in the Civil War and was in New Orleans, stationed in New Orleans. And it turned out that he came down with malaria, and she convinced her father to let her travel down to New Orleans in the middle of the Civil War to find her brother. They loved him. It was Haven. And she did. And she lived in New Orleans for a while. She found him. He was perfectly fine. And she ended up caring for the children of one of the military leaders there. And that's where she went back and taught. She went right before Goring. There was sort of a financial depression on then and not a lot of work. And she didn't have a large practice in her medical practice. So she went back to New Orleans and was the teacher for their children and other children there. And it was just for a few months before she went back to Paris. She almost got married during that time. There was a lot going on. But that's where she could get work, which was down there. And she loved being there. She loved the travel before she went to Paris.
I'll ask another question as we wait for final questions. it's been mentioned that we're living in a time where we are backsliding into misinformation and chauvinistic attitudes. Lydia, what organizations or movements would you recommend that we join to help maintain the power of women in today's society?
Oh my goodness. I would say keep doing what you're doing here. I'm somebody who likes to look at the very personal level, because looking at what's going on the large level, it freaks me out. So if you're, I tell my relatives, go find your church, find your organizations, find your political, even getting local people elected and campaigning for them, staying in touch with each other, and just realizing that small differences don't mean anything when you have something this radical going on. You have to learn, as I took that point from Mary Putnam Jacoby and all the feminists back then, is that getting over your petty disagreements and working together and actually having a plan and organizing. And I think that's what I've been telling myself, even though it's been shocking.
We have another question from Hank Robb in our Zoom community.
So apparently she had a lot to say about how to avoid pregnancy. What did she have anything to say about how women can have fun in bed as opposed to just not get pregnant?
She did. She didn't write about it, but she would talk about it, and she actually came out in favor of marriage early on. Early on, she was not a suffragist. Early on, she thought that women would do better by getting educated. She was young, but she would often talk about, and she was engaged one or two times before she actually married Dr. Jacoby, but she would talk to people quite, straightforwardly about her sex life and her marriage and things like that, and that women back then, it was, you only had sex in marriage, and she wasn't that outrageous. But yes, she was for birth control. She was very modern in the way she faced life, but she would not hesitate about talking about her own sex life and how great it was with other women.
Look at Hank raising the Valentine's Day adventure on this weekend with the final question there. Such an illuminating and engaging presentation and Q&A period. Really appreciate the talk and the time today. Keep up the good work and continued success with the book.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you so much for letting me come and talk to you guys.
Just a follow-up question. How did, I'm finding, personally, with what's going on, I'm quite angry. And I take that these women may have been angry, but they were very brave. I mean, Jacoby spent 2 years working at getting into the Sorbonne. I mean, that was really dedication and recognizing that I just have to take my time and she may have gotten angry, but she did it. How do you think they kept their heads and didn't just scream out?
Well, at the time, women had very little rights. I mean, a lot of women didn't know what seeking their own fulfillment felt like. But they did get angry. And believe me, while I was writing this, I had to kind of get up because a lot of things made me angry, and it was total preparation for what's happening today. But Mary had her family. The Putnams were extremely close. She had 10 younger brothers and sisters that she depended on. She took an interest in everything and everybody, and they had unbelievably number of friendships that women were made very, very close friendships back then. And that's what kept them going too. And, keeping your eyes on the prize. That was her, she didn't give up.